In the grand corridors of Kensington Palace, where centuries of royal tradition echo through marble halls, a simple phone call changed everything. The voice on the other end delivered news that would test the very foundation of modern royal duty. The Princess of Wales would need to step back, leaving her husband to carry on alone during one of the most critical moments for Britain's beloved NHS. But this isn't just another story about royal protocols or pandemic precautions. This is the untold tale of how a future king discovered that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is show up when no one expects them to. When the cameras were rolling, when the nation was watching, and when every gesture carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises to the people who serve on the front lines of hope and healing. What happened next would surprise even the most seasoned royal watchers, reshape public perception of the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain, and prove that sometimes the most human moments happen when we're forced to stand alone under the brightest lights. The morning of January 15th began like any other in the royal calendar, with a familiar rhythm of carefully orchestrated events and precisely timed appearances. Prince William stood in his private study at Kensington Palace, adjusting his navy blue tie while reviewing the day's schedule on his iPad. The NHS Heroes Awards ceremony was circled in red on his calendar, an event both he and Catherine had been looking forward to for weeks. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway broke his concentration. His private secretary, Simon Case, appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. The conversation that followed lasted only 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes would reshape the entire day and test William's ability to carry the crown's responsibilities entirely on his own shoulders. Catherine had woken up feeling unwell. Not seriously ill, but with symptoms that required immediate isolation as a precautionary measure. The royal household's strict COVID protocols meant there was no room for debate or delay. The Princess of Wales would need to remain at home, and Prince William would attend the NHS ceremony alone. The weight of this news settled over William like a familiar but unwelcome coat. He had grown accustomed to having Catherine by his side at these events, her natural warmth and genuine interest in people's stories complementing his more reserved approach. She had a gift for making healthcare workers feel truly seen and valued, often spending extra time with each person they met, asking follow-up questions that showed she had been listening carefully. As William made his way to the waiting car, his mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just about missing his wife's company or support. The NHS Heroes Awards represented something deeply personal to both of them. During the pandemic, they had witnessed firsthand the extraordinary sacrifices made by healthcare workers across Britain. They had seen the exhaustion in doctors' eyes during video calls, heard the tremor in nurses' voices as they described losing colleagues, and felt the weight of a nation's gratitude that could never fully repay such service. The drive through London's streets gave William time to reflect on the months leading up to this moment. The pandemic had fundamentally changed how the royal family connected with the public, forcing them to find new ways to show support and solidarity. Virtual visits had replaced handshakes, video calls had substituted for hospital walkarounds, and pre-recorded messages had taken the place of spontaneous conversations. But today was different. Today was about being physically present, about looking people in the eye and saying thank you in person. The NHS Heroes Awards ceremony had been designed as a celebration of resilience, a moment to honor those who had kept the country's healthcare system functioning during its darkest hours. William understood that his presence alone would need to carry the full weight of royal recognition and national gratitude. The venue, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, held special significance. As one of London's oldest hospitals, it had treated everyone from ordinary citizens to members of the royal family for nearly 9 centuries. Walking through its historic entrance, William was acutely aware that he was stepping into a place where life and death decisions were made every day, where ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of courage as part of their regular shifts. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the hospital's chief executive, greeted him at the entrance. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that showed the strain of leading during crisis. She had worked at Bart's for over 20 years. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but tired. She began guiding him toward the main auditorium while briefing him on the day's honorees. "Your Royal Highness, we have 15 exceptional individuals being recognized today," she explained as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of the hospital's founding physicians. Each one represents hundreds of others who went above and beyond during the pandemic. There's Marcus Thompson, a porter who worked double shifts for 6 months straight, never missing a day. Jennifer Walsh, an ICU nurse who developed new protocols that were adopted nationally. Ahmed Hassan, a junior doctor who organized mental health support for his colleagues while working on the COVID wards. William listened intently, making mental notes about each person's story. Without Catherine there to help him remember personal details and ask the right follow-up questions, he would need to rely entirely on his own preparation and instincts. The pressure felt different somehow, more intense and personal. As they approached the auditorium, William could hear the murmur of conversations and the occasional laugh from inside. These were people who had seen him on television countless times, but for many, this would be their first time meeting a member of the royal family in person. He understood that for some attendees, this moment would become a story they would tell their grandchildren, the day they met the future king and were recognized for their service to the nation. The ceremony itself was scheduled to last 2 hours, followed by an informal reception where William would have the opportunity to speak with each honoree individually. Without Catherine's natural ability to put people at ease and draw out their stories, William knew he would need to step outside his comfort zone and become more personally engaging than usual. Standing at the entrance to the auditorium, William took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. Through the partially open doors, he could see NHS workers in their best clothes, many still showing the signs of long hours and stress from the pandemic months. Some were fidgeting nervously with programs, others were checking their phones to send selfies to family members, and a few sat quietly, perhaps overwhelmed by being singled out for recognition when they saw their work as simply doing their jobs. Dr. Matthews touched his arm gently. "They're ready for you, sir. And if I may say, they're honored that you chose to be here today, especially under the circumstances." William nodded, understanding that she was acknowledging both Catherine's absence and his decision to proceed with the event. In royal terms, appearing solo at a high-profile engagement when your spouse was scheduled to attend sent a message about priorities and commitment. Today, that message would be about putting service to others above personal convenience or comfort. The doors opened fully, and William stepped into the auditorium. The conversation gradually died down as people noticed his arrival, but instead of the formal silence he was accustomed to, there was an energy in the room that felt more like anticipation than reverence. These were people who had saved lives during Britain's greatest health crisis in generations. They had earned the right to look a future king in the eye as equals, united by service rather than separated by protocol. As he walked toward the small stage at the front of the room, William made a decision that would define the entire event. Instead of proceeding directly to his seat at the head table, he paused and turned to address the room informally, without microphones or prepared remarks. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically designed space, "I want you to know that my wife, Catherine, is incredibly disappointed not to be here today. She has tremendous respect for each of you and the work you do. But she insisted that this ceremony go forward because she knows, as I do, that Britain owes you a debt that can never fully be repaid." The response was immediate and genuine, not polite applause, but the kind of appreciative murmur that comes when people feel truly understood. William realized in that moment that his decision to attend alone, rather than postponing the event, had been exactly right. Sometimes showing up, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, communicates more than any perfectly crafted speech or carefully planned gesture ever could. The ceremony was about to begin, but William already knew that this day would be different from any royal engagement he had ever undertaken. Without Catherine's partnership to rely on, he would need to find new ways to connect with people who deserved nothing less than his complete attention and authentic appreciation. The real test of his readiness to serve as king would not come from his ability to follow protocol, but from his capacity to genuinely honor the extraordinary ordinary people who kept Britain functioning when everything seemed to be falling apart. As he took his seat and the formal program began, William felt a mixture of nervousness and determination that reminded him of his military training. Sometimes the mission requires you to adapt on the fly, to find strength you didn't know you had, and to represent something larger than yourself even when you feel most alone. Today would be one of those days, and the stakes were nothing less than the future relationship between the monarchy and the people it serves. The ceremony began with a video presentation showcasing the pandemic's impact on Britain's healthcare system. Images flashed across the large screen mounted above the stage. Empty streets during lockdown, overwhelmed hospital wards, exhausted medical staff in full protective gear, and families saying goodbye to loved ones through video calls. William watched from his seat in the front row, but his attention was drawn equally to the faces of the audience members around him. Jennifer Walsh, the ICU nurse being honored that day, sat 3 rows behind him. During the most harrowing footage, William noticed her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her breathing slightly shallow. The video was bringing back memories that were still too fresh, too painful. Without thinking about protocol or proper procedure, William turned in his seat and caught her eye, offering a small nod of understanding that seemed to help her steady herself. This small exchange set the tone for everything that followed. Rather than maintaining the formal distance typically expected at royal events, William found himself responding instinctively to the human moments unfolding around him. When Ahmed Hassan, the junior doctor, wiped away tears during a tribute to colleagues who had died from COVID, William leaned forward slightly, silently acknowledging the young man's grief. When Marcus Thompson, the hospital porter, beamed with pride as his wife took photos from the audience, William smiled genuinely, remembering his own wedding day and the joy of sharing special moments with loved ones. Dr. Matthews took the podium to introduce the first honoree, but her prepared speech felt inadequate compared to the emotional weight in the room. She had planned to deliver formal remarks about institutional excellence and professional duty, but the presence of William, alone, attentive, and clearly moved by what he was witnessing, seemed to give her permission to speak more personally. When I think about the past 2 years, she began, departing from a written text, I don't think about statistics or policy decisions. I think about individual moments of courage that happened in hallways and patient rooms, usually with no one watching except the people whose lives were being saved. She went on to describe Jennifer Walsh's innovation during the crisis. Faced with ventilator shortages and overflowing ICU units, Jennifer had developed a patient positioning technique that improved oxygen flow without requiring additional equipment. She had tested it first on the sickest patients, staying extra hours to monitor results and documenting everything meticulously. When the technique proved successful, she had trained colleagues across multiple shifts, eventually seeing her innovation adopted by hospitals nationwide. But the statistics didn't capture the full story. Jennifer had developed her technique while grieving the loss of her own father to COVID, a man she hadn't been able to visit in his final weeks due to isolation protocols. Her innovation was born from the intersection of professional skill and personal loss, a desire to ensure that other families didn't experience the helplessness she had felt. When Jennifer was called to the stage to receive her recognition, William stood to shake her hand. What was planned as a brief, formal interaction became something more meaningful when she spoke quietly to him about her father. He was proud that I work for the NHS, she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. He used to say that caring for people was the highest calling anyone could have. I hope he would be proud of what we accomplished. William's response came from a place deeper than royal training or public relations strategy. Jennifer, your father would be proud not just of what you accomplished professionally, but of how you turned your grief into innovation that saved other people's children, other people's parents. That's not just medical skill, that's love in action. The authenticity of this exchange was felt throughout the auditorium. People pulled out phones to record the moment, but they also leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something genuine rather than performative. William was discovering that speaking from the heart, rather than following carefully crafted talking points, created connections that surprised even him. Ahmed Hassan's story proved equally compelling, but from a different angle. As a junior doctor, he had been among the most vulnerable members of the medical hierarchy during the crisis. Long hours, intense pressure, and the constant fear of making mistakes that could cost lives had taken a severe psychological toll on many young medical professionals. Ahmed had watched colleagues quit medicine entirely, unable to cope with the stress. His response had been to organize peer support groups that met informally during break times and shift changes. Using his knowledge of psychology from his undergraduate studies, he had created structured conversations that helped medical staff process trauma while building resilience. The program had started with just 5 participants meeting in a hospital break room, but it had grown to serve hundreds of healthcare workers across London. When Ahmed approached the podium to accept his award, his nervousness was obvious. He was young, perhaps 27, with the earnest demeanor of someone still surprised to be recognized for leadership. His prepared remarks were brief and humble, focusing on his colleagues rather than his own contributions. But when William asked him about the most important lesson he had learned during the pandemic, Ahmed's answer revealed wisdom beyond his years. "I learned that asking for help isn't weakness," he said. "And I learned that sometimes the most important medical intervention isn't a procedure or a medication. It's one human being telling another human being that they're not alone." This insight resonated deeply with William, who had struggled with his own mental health challenges in previous years and had become an advocate for breaking down stigma around psychological wellness. The conversation continued for several minutes, with William asking follow-up questions about Ahmed's techniques and the broader implications for healthcare worker support. Their discussion revealed something that hadn't been captured in the formal event planning. Ahmed's innovation hadn't just helped individual healthcare workers cope with stress. It had created a model for institutional change that was being studied by medical schools and hospital systems internationally. A junior doctors and formal support group had evolved into evidence-based practice that was changing how the medical profession approached psychological wellness. Marcus Thompson's recognition came next, and his story illustrated yet another dimension of pandemic heroism. As a hospital porter, he was responsible for transporting patients between departments, moving medical equipment, and maintaining supply chains that kept the hospital functioning. His job didn't require advanced medical training, but it required stamina, reliability, and the ability to provide comfort to frightened patients during some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. During the pandemic's peak, Marcus had volunteered for double shifts 6 months consecutively, working 16-hour days without missing a single day. He had transported COVID patients to isolation wards, wheeled critically ill people to emergency surgeries, and helped families navigate hospital logistics during visiting restrictions. His supervisor estimated that Marcus had personally interacted with over 3,000 patients during the crisis. But the numbers only told part of Marcus's story. Colleagues described his ability to calm anxious patients with gentle conversation during transport, his skill at anticipating medical teams' needs before they asked, and his practice of staying late to help overwhelmed staff with tasks outside his official responsibilities. When Marcus stood to receive his award, his physical presence commanded attention in a way that surprised many attendees. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with calloused hands and a weathered face that spoke of years of physical labor. But his smile was gentle, and when he spoke about his work, his voice carried the warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed helping others. William's conversation with Marcus revealed insights about the often overlooked support staff who keep hospitals running. Marcus explained that porters see patients at their most vulnerable moments, scared, in pain, and often alone. Learning to provide comfort while maintaining professional boundaries required emotional intelligence that wasn't taught in any training program. "People think my job is about moving things from place to place," Marcus told William. "But really, it's about helping people feel safe when everything feels uncertain." This perspective shifted William's understanding of hospital hierarchies and the different ways people contribute to healing. Marcus's work didn't require medical degrees or specialized training, but it required qualities: empathy, reliability, physical strength, emotional resilience, that were equally essential to patient care. As the formal recognition ceremony continued, William found himself increasingly engaged in these individual stories. Each honoree represented not just personal achievement, but different models of leadership and service that challenged conventional ideas about heroism and professional excellence. The afternoon was revealing something important about the nature of effective leadership during crisis. The people being honored hadn't succeeded because they followed established protocols or waited for official permission to innovate. They had identified problems, developed solutions, and taken responsibility for implementation, often working outside normal institutional boundaries. Jennifer had created new medical techniques, Ahmed had developed psychological support systems, and Marcus had redefined customer service in healthcare settings. Each had seen needs that weren't being met by existing systems and had taken initiative to address those needs, even when doing so required additional effort and personal risk. Their stories were reshaping William's understanding of his own role and responsibilities. As a future king, he would need to support innovation and initiative rather than simply maintaining traditions. The pandemic had shown that effective leadership requires adaptability, creativity, and the willingness to empower others to develop solutions rather than waiting for top-down direction. The ceremony was only halfway complete, but William was already recognizing that this day would influence his approach to royal duties for years to come. These healthcare workers were teaching him about leadership through their examples, showing him what it meant to serve others with both competence and compassion, even when the personal costs were significant. As the formal ceremony transitioned into the reception portion of the event, William made a decision that would have surprised his protection officers had they known it was coming. Instead of following the planned route through the reception, where he would spend precisely 3 minutes with each honoree in a receiving line format, he asked Dr. Matthews if they could eliminate the formal structure entirely. "I'd like to just move around the room naturally," he told her quietly. "These people have extraordinary stories, and I don't want our conversation to be limited by time constraints or protocol." Dr. Matthews looked momentarily startled. Royal events were typically choreographed down to the minute, with every interaction planned and time to ensure efficiency and security. But she recognized something in William's demeanor that suggested this wasn't a casual request. It was a necessary one. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," she replied. "I think our guests would appreciate a more relaxed approach." What happened next transformed the entire atmosphere of the event. Instead of formal presentations where honorees approached William's position, he began moving through the reception space like any other guest, introducing himself to family members, asking follow-up questions about people's work, and genuinely listening to their responses. His first extended conversation was with Maria Santos, a hospital cleaner whose contributions during the pandemic had been initially overlooked by the awards committee. Maria had been working at St. Bartholomew's for 15 years, responsible for maintaining sterile environments in operating rooms and patient care areas. When COVID protocols required enhanced cleaning procedures, Maria had voluntarily researched international best practices and developed new sanitization techniques that exceeded official guidelines. More importantly, Maria had trained dozens of colleagues in proper protective equipment use, often staying after her shift to ensure that everyone understood protocols that could literally mean the difference between life and death. Her supervisor credited her with preventing multiple potential infections among hospital staff, but Maria's contributions hadn't been quantified in ways that made them obvious candidates for formal recognition. When William approached Maria, She seemed genuinely shocked that he knew who she was. Dr. Matthews had briefed him about her contributions during their walk to the reception, and William had made a mental note to seek her out. "Maria, I understand that you became something of an expert on infection control during the pandemic," he said, extending his hand for a handshake that lasted longer than typical royal protocol suggested. "I just want to keep everyone safe," Maria replied, her English accented by her native Portuguese, but clear and confident. "My daughter, she studies biology at university. She helped me research the science behind cleaning protocols. We wanted to be sure we were doing everything possible." This revealed something William hadn't expected. Maria's innovations weren't just the result of experience and dedication. They represented a family effort that had combined practical knowledge with academic research. Her daughter had provided scientific background, while Maria contributed real-world application, creating solutions that were both theoretically sound and practically feasible. "Tell me about your daughter," William said, genuinely curious about the family dynamics that had contributed to Maria's success. "Elena, she wants to be a doctor," Maria explained, her pride obvious. "During lockdown, when she was home from university, she would help me understand the research papers about virus transmission. We would practice new cleaning techniques together in our kitchen before I tried them at the hospital." This story illustrated something profound about how innovation actually happens during crisis. Maria's effectiveness hadn't come from top-down directives or institutional training programs. It had emerged from the combination of her practical experience, her daughter's academic knowledge, and their shared commitment to protecting others. The most effective pandemic response had often happened at this intersection of formal knowledge and informal initiative. William spent nearly 20 minutes with Maria and her family, asking Elena about her studies and learning about their collaborative approach to problem solving. The conversation revealed insights about community resilience that wouldn't have emerged in a formal 3-minute interaction. His next significant conversation was with Dr. Robert Chun, an anesthesiologist whose innovation had addressed one of the pandemic's most dangerous challenges. When ventilator shortages threatened to overwhelm ICU capacity, Dr. Chun had developed techniques for safely managing multiple patients with limited equipment. His approach required precise monitoring and constant adjustment, but it had allowed the hospital to treat nearly twice as many critically ill patients as conventional protocols would have permitted. But Dr. Chin's story had a personal dimension that made his professional achievements even more remarkable. His elderly parents lived in a care facility that had been devastated by COVID outbreaks. Unable to visit them safely due to his own exposure risks at the hospital, Dr. Chun had experienced the same separation and worry that affected thousands of families during the crisis. "The hardest part wasn't the long hours or the technical challenges," he told William. "It was going home each night knowing that I was potentially carrying risks that could harm the people I loved most. Every day was a balance between my responsibility to my patients and my responsibility to my family." This personal dimension of pandemic service hadn't been captured in most public discussions about healthcare heroism. Dr. Chun and his colleagues hadn't just worked longer hours or developed new techniques. They had made profound personal sacrifices, accepting levels of stress and isolation that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. William found himself deeply moved by Dr. Chin's honesty about the psychological toll of pandemic service. As someone who had dealt with his own mental health challenges, William understood that acknowledging vulnerability required courage, especially for professionals who were expected to project strength and confidence. "How did you manage the stress of such impossible choices?" William asked. "I learned that perfectionism is the enemy of effectiveness," Dr. Chin replied. "There were no perfect choices during the pandemic, only better and worse ones. I had to accept that doing my best didn't mean avoiding all risks or solving every problem." This insight resonated with William's own experience of public life, where every decision carried consequences and criticism, and where the pressure to avoid mistakes could paralyze decision-making entirely. Dr. Chin's approach, focusing on effectiveness rather than perfection, represented a form of wisdom that applied far beyond medical practice. Their conversation continued as William learned about Dr. Chen's family background. His parents had immigrated to Britain in the 1970s, working multiple jobs to provide education opportunities for their children. Dr. Chen's success as a physician represented the fulfillment of generational dreams and sacrifices, but the pandemic had threatened everything his family had worked to achieve. "My parents survived the Cultural Revolution in China," Dr. Chen explained. "They taught me that resilience isn't about avoiding hardship. It's about finding meaning in struggle. When I felt overwhelmed during the worst days of the pandemic, I remembered their example." This perspective linked Dr. Chen's pandemic service to broader themes of immigrant experience, family obligation, and intergenerational responsibility. His innovations in patient care weren't just medical achievements. They were expressions of values passed down through his family's history of overcoming adversity. As William moved through the reception, he began to notice patterns in the stories he was hearing. Almost every honoree described their achievements in terms of collaboration rather than individual heroism. Jennifer Walsh credited her team with implementing her innovations. Ahmed Hassan emphasized his colleagues' willingness to participate in support groups. Marcus Thompson talked about the cleaning staff and security guards who had helped him maintain hospital operations. This collaborative approach challenged conventional narratives about leadership and achievement. The people being honored weren't lone heroes who had single-handedly solved problems. They were connectors and facilitators who had identified opportunities to bring people together around shared challenges. Dr. Sarah Patel, a respiratory therapist, exemplified this collaborative approach. When ventilator protocols needed to be adapted for COVID patients, she had organized informal training sessions that included not just medical staff, but also engineers who maintained the equipment, cleaning staff who needed to understand contamination risks, and administrative personnel who tracked resources and supplies. "No one person had all the knowledge we needed," Dr. Patel explained to William. "The engineers understood the machines, the medical staff understood the patients, the cleaning staff understood infection control, and the administrators understood resource allocation. We needed everyone's expertise to develop solutions that actually worked." This insight challenged traditional hierarchies that often limited problem-solving to specific professional categories. Dr. Patel's approach had created temporary teams that crossed departmental boundaries, bringing together different types of knowledge and experience to address complex challenges. William found himself thinking about applications for his own work. Royal initiatives often followed traditional approaches that relied on established institutions and formal partnerships. But the pandemic innovations he was learning about suggested that effective solutions often emerge from unexpected collaborations between people with different backgrounds and perspectives. As the afternoon progressed, William realized that his decision to abandon formal protocol had created opportunities for learning that wouldn't have been possible in a traditional royal engagement. The extended conversations were revealing insights about leadership, innovation, and community resilience that would influence his understanding of his future role as king. The healthcare workers weren't just sharing their pandemic experiences. They were teaching him about different models of service and responsibility. Their examples suggested that effective leadership required humility, curiosity, and willingness to learn from unexpected sources rather than simply maintaining authority through traditional means. The reception was scheduled to end at 4 o'clock, but William showed no signs of rushing through his remaining conversations. His protection detail had quietly adjusted their positions to accommodate his more informal approach, and Dr. Matthews had canceled her next appointment to remain available for whatever the event might require. This flexibility represented something important about adapting to changing circumstances rather than rigidly following predetermined plans. The afternoon was becoming exactly what it needed to be: a genuine exchange between people who had served others during extraordinary circumstances, learning from each other rather than simply going through ceremonial motions. William was discovering that his most effective role might not be as a distant figure offering formal recognition, but as someone willing to listen carefully and Learn humbly from people whose experiences had tested and proven their character in ways that palace life never could. The most transformative conversation of William's day began when he met Thomas Harrison, a hospital maintenance worker whose story had almost been overlooked entirely. Thomas was 62 years old, a quiet man who had worked in various roles at St. Bartholomew's for over 30 years. During the pandemic, he had continued his regular duties maintaining heating, ventilation, and electrical systems, but he had also taken on an unexpected role that had profound impact on hospital morale. Thomas had started arriving at work 2 hours early each day to prepare encouraging notes that he left in break rooms, nursing stations, and staff lockers. These weren't generic motivational messages, but personalized observations about individual staff members' contributions, written in Thomas's careful handwriting on pieces of hospital stationery. "Good morning, Dr. Patel," one note had read. "Yesterday, I watched you spend extra time explaining procedures to the new respiratory therapist. Your patience and kindness make this hospital a better place. Thank you for caring about people, not just patients." Another note, left for a young nurse named Sophie, had said, "Sophie, I see how tired you are after your double shifts, but I also see how you always smile at patients even when you think no one is watching. That smile is medicine too." Thomas had written hundreds of these notes over the course of the pandemic, creating an informal support network that boosted morale during the darkest periods. Staff members had begun collecting his notes, sharing them with colleagues, and some had started writing their own encouraging messages to each other, creating a culture of appreciation that outlasted the crisis. When William approached Thomas during the reception, the older man seemed genuinely bewildered about why he was being honored. He hadn't developed new medical techniques or managed complex logistics. He had simply paid attention to people and found ways to acknowledge their contributions. "Mr. Harrison," William said, extending his hand, "I understand that you became something of a morale officer during the pandemic." Thomas smiled shyly, his weathered hands showing the calluses of decades of manual labor. "I just wrote some notes," he said. "People were working so hard, so scared. I thought maybe if someone noticed what they were doing, it might help a little." This simple explanation belied the sophistication of Thomas's emotional intelligence. His notes had addressed a fundamental human need that medical training and administrative policies couldn't meet: the need to feel seen and valued as individuals rather than just functional units in a healthcare system. "How did you know what to write?" William asked. "How did you know what people needed to hear?" Thomas considered this question carefully. "I've been watching people work in this hospital for 30 years, he said finally. "You learn to see when someone's struggling, when they're proud of something they've done, when they need encouragement. Most people just want to know that their work matters." This insight revealed a form of leadership that operated entirely outside formal authority structures. Thomas had no management responsibilities, no budget, no staff. But he had influenced hospital culture more profoundly than many administrators with advanced degrees and substantial resources. William found himself thinking about his own position and the various ways influence could be exercised. Traditional royal power operated through official channels, formal events, and institutional partnerships. But Thomas had demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful leadership happened through individual connections and personal attention to others' experiences. Their conversation continued as Thomas explained his approach to writing the notes. He had studied people's routines, learning when different staff members arrived for shifts, took breaks, or finished their workdays. He had observed their interactions with patients and colleagues, noting moments of kindness, competence, or dedication that others might have overlooked. "The hardest part was writing notes for people when they had bad days," Thomas said. "When someone made a mistake or lost a patient or got criticized by a supervisor. Those were the times when encouragement mattered most, but also when it was hardest to know what to say." This sensitivity to timing and context revealed emotional sophistication that challenged stereotypes about education and expertise. Thomas had developed psychological insights that were as valuable as any formal training in organizational behavior or human resources management. William asked Thomas about his background, learning that he had left school at 16 to support his family after his father's death. He had worked various jobs, construction, factory work, retail, before finding stable employment at the hospital in his 30s. His life experience had taught him about struggle, resilience, and the importance of small kindnesses during difficult times. "I never had children of my own," Thomas explained, "but working here, watching young doctors and nurses learn their jobs, dealing with the stress, I suppose they became like family to me. When your family is hurting, you try to help however you can." This paternal perspective had shaped Thomas's entire approach to hospital relationships. He saw younger staff members not as subordinates or colleagues, but as people deserving protection and encouragement. His notes had been expressions of care rather than management strategies. The conversation revealed something profound about the different types of intelligence that contribute to organizational success. Thomas lacked formal education or professional credentials, but he possessed emotional and social intelligence that had measurably improved hospital culture during crisis. Dr. Matthews, who had been listening to parts of their conversation, shared additional context about Thomas's impact. Exit interviews with staff who had left during the pandemic consistently mentioned his encouragement as a factor that had helped them persist longer than they otherwise would have. New staff members often mentioned his notes as part of what helped them feel welcomed and valued during orientation. Thomas created something that all our official employee wellness programs couldn't achieve, Dr. Matthews told William. He made people feel individually seen and appreciated in a system that necessarily treats people as categories and functions most of the time. This achievement had broader implications for understanding how large institutions could maintain human connection and individual recognition. Thomas's approach suggested that effective organizational culture required informal networks of care and attention that supplemented formal policies and procedures. William spent over 30 minutes with Thomas, longer than with any other individual at the event. The conversation ranged from Thomas's specific note-writing techniques to broader questions about motivation, recognition, and workplace relationships. William found himself taking mental notes that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with understanding how real leadership actually worked. As they talked, other reception attendees began gravitating toward their conversation. Staff members who had received Thomas's notes wanted to thank him personally, sharing stories about how his messages had affected them during particularly difficult periods. Sophie, the young nurse Thomas had mentioned in his note, approached with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Harrison, I kept every note you wrote me," she said. "When I was thinking about quitting nursing altogether, I read them again and remembered why I wanted to do this work in the first place." Dr. Chun, the anesthesiologist William had spoken with earlier, joined the group. "Thomas, I never told you this, but your note about my parents made me cry. You somehow knew exactly what I needed to hear at exactly the right time." These testimonials revealed the cumulative impact of Thomas's individual acts of attention and encouragement. His notes hadn't just provided momentary comfort. They had influenced career decisions, relationship to work, and commitment to serving others. William realized he was witnessing something that rarely happened in his official duties. He was seeing direct evidence of how individual actions created ripple effects that strengthened entire communities. Thomas's simple practice of writing encouraging notes had created a network of appreciation and mutual support that continued long after the crisis had passed. The informal gathering around Thomas became one of the most meaningful moments of William's day. Instead of formal presentations or structured conversations, people were sharing authentic stories about human connection and mutual care. The future king found himself learning about leadership from a maintenance worker who had never held a management position or attended a leadership training program. As the afternoon grew later, William began to understand that Thomas's story represented something essential about service that his royal training had never addressed directly. Traditional concepts of duty focused on obligation, responsibility, and sacrifice for larger purposes. But Thomas had demonstrated that the most effective service often emerged from genuine care for individual people rather than abstract commitment to institutions or causes. "Thomas," William said as their conversation began to wind down, "you've taught me something important today about paying attention to people. Your approach to encouragement, the personal notes, the individual recognition, that's something I'd like to incorporate into my own work." Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "Your Royal Highness, you don't need advice from someone like me about how to do your job." "Actually," William replied, "I think advice from someone like you is exactly what I need. You've shown me that real leadership isn't about having authority over people. It's about paying attention to people. That's a lesson I won't forget." This exchange represented a reversal of traditional expectations about learning and teaching. William, with his formal education and institutional training, was acknowledging that Thomas, with his practical experience and emotional intelligence, had insights that were equally valuable for understanding effective leadership. The conversation marked a turning point in William's understanding of his future role as king. The afternoon had begun with him trying to fulfill traditional royal duties in Catherine's absence. But it was ending with him recognizing that his most important preparation for kingship might come from unexpected sources and informal learning rather than formal training and official protocol. As the reception officially concluded, William knew that his relationship with these NHS workers would continue beyond this single event. He had learned too much and been changed too much to simply return to business as usual. The challenge would be finding ways to apply these lessons within the constraints and expectations of royal life, while honoring the authentic connections he had made with people whose service had tested and proven their character in ways that his own life had not yet required. As the formal reception concluded and William prepared for his departure from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, he made an unprecedented decision. Instead of following the planned schedule that would have him leaving immediately after the event, he asked Dr. Matthews if he could take a brief tour of the hospital's COVID wards that had been at the center of the pandemic response. "I'd like to see where these people worked," he told her quietly. "I think it would help me understand their stories better." This request surprised his security detail and required rapid adjustments to transportation and scheduling, but Dr. Matthews immediately understood its importance. The wards had been largely returned to normal operations, but they still bore subtle signs of the extraordinary measures that had been implemented during the crisis. As they walked through corridors that had once been designated COVID zones, Dr. Matthews explained the logistical challenges that had required constant adaptation and innovation. Rooms had been reconfigured to accommodate isolation protocols, ventilation systems had been modified to prevent airborne transmission, and entire sections of the hospital had been reorganized to separate COVID patients from other medical needs. "What you have to understand," Dr. Matthews said as they passed a nursing station that had been the command center for COVID response, "is that we were making life and death decisions every day based on incomplete information. The protocols were changing constantly as we learned more about the virus, which meant our staff had to be incredibly flexible and constantly willing to learn new procedures." This context helped William understand that the innovations he had learned about during the award ceremony weren't just individual achievements. They were part of a larger institutional transformation that had required unprecedented collaboration and adaptability from everyone in the hospital. They paused at the entrance to what had been the main COVID ICU, now converted back to general intensive care. Jennifer Walsh, the nurse who had developed new patient positioning techniques, had asked to join them for this part of the tour. She wanted to show William the specific challenges that had led to her innovations. "This room held 12 beds during normal times," Jennifer explained, "but we managed to safely treat 22 patients at the peak of the crisis. That was only possible because we completely reimagined how to use space, equipment, and staff resources." She walked William through the physical layout, explaining how patient positioning techniques had been combined with creative equipment placement to maximize both safety and efficiency. But the technical details were less important than the human dimension of what had happened in this space. Every patient who came through here was someone's family member, Jennifer continued. Parents, grandparents, adult children. Most of them were scared, and many of them were alone because of visiting restrictions. We weren't just treating their medical conditions. We were trying to provide comfort and hope when everything felt hopeless. This emotional dimension of pandemic care had been largely invisible to the general public, who had focused primarily on infection rates, hospital capacity, and vaccine development. But Jennifer's description revealed that healthcare workers had been providing psychological and spiritual care alongside medical treatment, often serving as surrogate family members for patients who couldn't have loved ones present. William asked about the psychological toll this had taken on staff members, and Jennifer's response was honest and sobering. We lost colleagues to the virus, she said simply, and we watched many more leave healthcare entirely because they couldn't handle stress. The people being honored today are the ones who found ways to keep going, but we shouldn't forget that many good people couldn't continue, and that wasn't a failure on their part. This perspective added complexity to the day's celebration of resilience and innovation. The healthcare workers being recognized weren't just examples of individual strength. They were survivors of a system-wide trauma that had affected thousands of people in different ways. As they continued the tour, William encountered several staff members who hadn't been part of the award ceremony, but who had worked alongside the honorees during the pandemic. A young medical resident named David Kim approached tentatively, clearly nervous about speaking to a royal family member, but apparently motivated by something urgent he wanted to communicate. "Your Royal Highness," David said, his voice slightly shaky. "I wanted to thank you for coming today and for taking time to really listen to people's stories. But I also wanted you to know that what you saw today, the innovation, the collaboration, the dedication that happens here every day, not just during crises." This comment stopped William short. David was pointing out something important that had been implicit in the day's conversations, but not explicitly acknowledged. The pandemic had revealed extraordinary capabilities and character traits that already existed within the healthcare system. Crisis hadn't created these qualities. It had made them visible and necessary. "Tell me more about that," Williams said, genuinely interested in David's perspective. Jennifer's patient positioning techniques, David explained. She had been thinking about those problems for years before the pandemic, experimenting with small improvements during normal times. Ahmed's peer support groups built on relationships and trust that had developed over months and years of working together. Marcus's ability to comfort patients came from thousands of previous interactions, not just pandemic situations. David's insights suggested that the pandemic innovations hadn't emerged from nowhere. They had grown from existing seeds of creativity, compassion, and collaboration that were always present, but often unrecognized during normal operations. "What this means," David continued, gaining confidence as he spoke, "is that there are probably innovations and solutions happening right now during routine operations that could transform healthcare if we paid attention to them the same way we paid attention during the crisis." This observation had profound implications for how institutions could identify and support innovation. Instead of waiting for emergency situations to reveal hidden capabilities, organizations could actively seek out and nurture the creative problem-solving that happened constantly at the front lines of service delivery. William spent several more minutes with David, learning about his observations of daily healthcare innovation. The young resident described nurses who had developed more efficient wound care techniques, technicians who had improved diagnostic procedures, and administrative staff who had streamlined patient communication processes. These improvements happened regularly, but rarely received formal recognition or systematic implementation. "The pandemic taught us to pay attention to frontline innovation," David said. "But we need to keep paying attention after the crisis passes, or we'll miss opportunities to improve care for everyone." As William completed his tour and prepared for departure, He reflected on how profoundly the day had changed his understanding of leadership, service, and his own role as a future king. The healthcare workers had taught him that effective leadership often meant empowering others to innovate rather than directing innovation from above. The stories he had heard illustrated different models of service that challenged conventional approaches to royal duty. Instead of maintaining distance and formal authority, effective service often required personal engagement, genuine curiosity about others' experiences, and willingness to learn from unexpected sources. Standing at the hospital entrance where the day had begun, William took a moment to process what he had experienced. The awards ceremony had been planned as a routine royal engagement, formal recognition, brief conversations, ceremonial photographs. Instead, it had become an intensive education in leadership, innovation, and the human dimensions of service. His decision to attend alone, initially seen as an unfortunate necessity due to Catherine's illness, had created opportunities for deeper engagement that wouldn't have been possible if he had been focused on coordinating with a partner during conversations. The healthcare workers had shared their stories with unusual candor and depth, partly because William had demonstrated genuine interest in learning from them rather than simply acknowledging their achievements. His willingness to abandon protocol and spend extended time with each person had communicated respect and curiosity that had encouraged authenticity. As his car pulled away from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, William began thinking about how to apply these lessons within the constraints and expectations of royal life. The challenge would be finding ways to bring this same level of personal engagement and informal learning to other royal duties without undermining the dignity and effectiveness of institutional functions. But he also recognized that some changes could be implemented immediately. His approach to future engagements could incorporate more extended conversations, fewer formal barriers between himself and the people he met, and greater emphasis on learning rather than simply representing royal authority. The day had also clarified something important about his future role as king. The monarchy's relevance in modern Britain wouldn't depend on maintaining traditional distance and ceremony, but on finding authentic ways to connect with and support the people who were already solving problems and serving others effectively. The NHS workers had demonstrated that the most valuable royal function might be recognizing and amplifying the innovations and dedication that already existed throughout British society, rather than attempting to direct or control social progress from above. As he returned to Kensington Palace, William knew that Catherine would want to hear detailed accounts of every conversation and story from the day. But he also knew that this experience had changed him in ways that would influence his approach to royal service for the rest of his career. The afternoon had begun as a single event on a royal calendar. It had become a masterclass in leadership, a lesson in authentic service, and a preview of what his reign as king could become if he had the courage to prioritize genuine engagement with his subjects over the safer path of maintaining traditional royal distance. The healthcare workers had honored him with their stories, their insights, and their examples. Now it was his responsibility to honor them by applying what he had learned and finding ways to support the innovation, collaboration, and dedication that happened every day throughout the kingdom, often without recognition, but always with profound impact on the lives of others. The day had proven that sometimes the most important royal duty was simply showing up, paying attention, and learning from the people whose service tested and revealed character in ways that palace life never could. It was a lesson that would reshape everything that followed.